Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Black Fashion History, the podcast that celebrates the contributions of Black people all around the world to the fashion industry. And I'm very excited today because we have a special episode talking about an amazing moment in fashion history with an amazing filmmaker. And so I'm happy to welcome Deborah Riley-Draper to the show. Now, if you never heard of her, Deborah Riley-Draper is an Atlanta-based filmmaker who began her career with the fashion documentary Versailles 73. And if you have listened to any of my podcasts, you already know about the Battle of Versailles and its significance in Black fashion history. And with last year being the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Versailles, that showcased Black models, and there was a Black designer. I'm excited to speak with Deborah today to just talk about her filmmaking journey, talk about the documentary in general, and just hear all of her wonderful insights. So thank you, Deborah, for joining us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm always honored to be anywhere where we're talking about Black fashion history. So thank you for the invitation. And as you know, this is my favorite topic in the whole world. The literal greatest fashion catwalk catfight in the history of fashion happened November 28th, 1973 at the Chateau de Versailles in Paris. And as a result of the 12 Black models who were there, American ready to wear became a global phenomenon. So yes, let's talk about that moment. It's incredible. And literally, it was the impetus of my first film. I'd never heard of that. And the minute I heard just a snippet of a conversation from one of the models, I knew I had to make a movie about it.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to get into that. I will say before we get started, I was familiar with your work, though not from Versailles 73, though I watched that a little bit later, but from the 20 Pearls documentary. That's the first documentary of yours I've seen. So it's obvious that you have this love and passion for Black history and telling our stories, which is a passion that I also share. So I know that this is going to be a great conversation. But before we get into the doc, I would love for you to share with my audience, like, when did you fall in love with storytelling? And then what, as a second part to the question, like, what leads you to kind of dig into Black history specifically?
I fell in love with stories as a small child. The minute I began to read, I realized that books and stories allow us to see a bigger version of the world and also allow us to push ourselves to be a part of that bigger world. And so stories transport us, but stories also have an accountability and a reckoning that I think is critically important. My love of Black history, my mom was a public school teacher, and it was very important to her for me to understand my history, my family's history, and also the bigger history of our community. So that's where it began. But the story of Versailles, how I became a filmmaker, I was literally in my car driving to work. I was a vice president at an ad agency, big ad agency with one of the holding companies. And I was driving to work, minding my own business, not bothering anyone. And I turned on the radio, and there was a researcher being interviewed, and he talked about this research study that he did that said Black women were the ugliest women in the world.
I remember that.
You remember this?
Yes.
This was on the cover of
It was on the cover, like Psychology Today.
You already know. So this is 2011, and I'm like, what the hell? And how did he get grant money to go do this like ludicrous study? And the fact that it's being celebrated and discussed as if it's real research. And I said, you know what? There are not enough voices in media telling the story of Black women and telling the story of the lived Black experience and our impact, not only on science and policy, but our impact on fashion and beauty, because he was coming at this angle. He's like, I measured the noses and the eyes and the lips, and Black women are just the least attractive women on the planet. And so I'm just simmering in my car as I get to my office, truly mad. And I thought, I have to do something about this. The next day in the car, divine intervention, Barbara Summers, I catch the end of her saying, well, it was the most glorious moment in fashion, and Black women made it happen. And I'm like, Black women made what happen? What was the most glorious moment in fashion? So I Googled to find the rest of her interview, and she was talking about that night at Versailles when Beth Ann Hardison, Pat Cleveland, Alva Chen, Barbara Jackson, Charlene Dash, all these amazing Black women helped Halston, Oscar de la Renta, Anne Klein, Stephen Burrows, and Bill Blass make a name for themselves in Paris. And they helped establish those brands. They helped change America from being a fashion wannabe to a fashion powerhouse in pret-a-porter. And I thought, damn, that is quite a story. Somebody ought to do a movie about that. And my husband said, well, why don't you do a movie about it? And I was like, you know what? Why don't I do a movie about it? I'm going to do a movie about it. That became the very first film that I ever wrote, directed, and produced. That's my first documentary. It screened at the Marché du Film in Cannes at the Cannes Film Festival in 2012. Was ultimately picked up by Logo and aired after RuPaul's Drag Race. So that's my first fashion experience, and it was glorious and it was wonderful. But what I learned in the process was, wow, Black women and Black men have historically changed style and fashion and beauty for the better. Since Elizabeth Ketley forward, all of the seamstresses, all of the Black women who were making clothes for people literally crafted how America looked, whether they received credit for that or not. And Stephen Burrows, fortunately, at the Battle of Versailles, solidified his place as one of the most important designers in fashion history. So I had to do the story. I mean, come on.
So I just want to go back a little bit because you said a lot of things that kind of surprised me. So you were not looking for a career change at all.
Well, I always wanted to be a filmmaker, and that was
Okay.
something because I worked in commercials at an ad agency. But in that exact moment, I wasn't going to make a movie then. I was going to grow into it, but you know, as duty calls, right?
Yes. Okay. And so I love that that kind of drew you into like your first foray into filmmaking
Yeah.
was, your desire to uncover this story. Now, you talked a little bit about what drew you into it. Now, how did you get started? Because that seems like a big undertaking. You hear this interview, you hear about this iconic moment that you weren't familiar with before. So, like, how do you go into uncovering the details of this story and presenting it in a way to share with the world?
You know what I did? I Googled to see who was in the show first, and I found Stephen Burrows. And I literally called Stephen at his office and said, hi, I'm Deborah Riley-Draper. I'm a filmmaker, and I want to make a film about the most iconic fashion show ever at Versailles. And he said, oh my God, so many people have always called me about this and no one's ever done it. Are you actually going to do it? And I was like, yes, sir, I'm actually going to do it. And he said, well, if you're going to do it, then you can have my interview. And I said, I'll be in New York in 2 weeks to get your interview. And he said, let me connect you with Robert and he'll get a time and I'll interview with you. And I said, great. And I hung up the phone and I was like, oh my God. I had no camera, no money for this production, no crew, no ticket to New York, nothing. But I was like, okay, let me make this happen. Because I worked in advertising, I called a few friends and they hooked me up with the DP and I had a crew and I was like, hey guys, I don't have any money for a film, but I'm getting ready to make one. Are you guys willing to ride with me? We're going to New York and then we're going to go to Paris. And they were like, uh, okay. And 2 weeks later, we were in Stephen Burrows' office, cameras, 2 cameras, gear, everything. And he was so thrilled that someone was actually asking him real questions, not only about Versailles, but about his inspiration, about his grandmother, about his time at FIT, about why the lettuce edge was so prominent in his designs and why he chose such form-fitting fluid designs that fit Black women so perfectly, right? So we had a wonderful conversation. And at the end of this conversation, he says, well, you need to talk to Pat. You need to talk to Alba. And he opened up his Rolodex and gave me everyone else's phone numbers. And I called everyone and got the interviews.
That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
I would have done the same thing. If I called up Stephen Burrows and he told me I could have an interview, I would walk to New York if I
I
had
would have walked to
to.
New York. Do you understand? I
Like,
would have
but we are going
walked
to
to
get
New
this
York.
interview.
I would have carried, myself on my own back to get to New York to do that interview because his voice is so important, right? And he's a quiet, private man, but his voice is important in our history because when you look at his fashion and when you look at his designs, you see us, but you
Right.
also see a community that is liberated. You see a community in the 70s that's free. You see Black power. You see this post-civil rights independence, this creativity, this rebellion against, what has been to create what will be, right? So that's why I was like, I'm going to New York. We're going to make this film because what the Black women did in that moment and what Stephen Burrows did in that moment was they definitively inserted in a very prominent, dominant, and loud way what our contributions are and what they've always been. And they did that on a global stage in Paris, in front of YSL, in front of Dior, in front of Ungaro, in front of Cardin, oh my gosh, in front of Hubert Givenchy. Everyone was there, and everyone began to recognize that, wow, America has something to say. And that also began as a result of this event for Givenchy, his cabine for the next, as you know, his cabine for the next 11 years would be completely filled with Black women.
Right. And that's why I think it's so important that, you made a film telling this story. I think for much of fashion, people can look at the Battle of Versailles as just the night that America won fashion or the night where like America finally became like a major player in the industry and forget about or not even acknowledge the contributions of the Black people in that space. While it was not just about America, but it was about Black America as well. I mean, you had Stephen Burrows, as you mentioned, as like the only Black designer.
And the youngest designer, period.
And then a host of these beautiful Black models that were not celebrated in the US, but here they are in Paris, which is the fashion capital of the world.
They become the darlings.
And they took over, like they commanded the stage, they commanded the room, they took over the event to the point where, like you mentioned, you have, Givenchy's cabine and they took over Europe.
Yeah. Albert Shen becomes the muse of Valentino.
Exactly.
Come on.
Exactly. I'm like, that is something that needs to be told and not ignored and also celebrated and part of our history that needs to be shared. So I am, in love with the work that you do in that respect, not just because I'm a lover of fashion, but also because I'm a lover of us. And I think it's so important for us to see ourselves in the media and in these works. So I am curious, like, have you always been interested in fashion or was the draw just the story itself?
The story, yes, but I couldn't resist the draw to go to Paris. I'd been to Paris a number of times prior to going there to shoot, but to shoot in Paris and to shoot in New York, that was irresistible to me. But there is this interesting connection to me between African American history and Paris, right? Mm-hmm. Like from Josephine Baker to, Richard Wright to James Baldwin to so many of the jazz artists to Ramir Bearden, the great collages. There is a draw, but there's also an appreciation. And there's also what appears to be a space where Black creators can create, sometimes in ways that we may not have been able to freely create in America. So seeing those women not only impact that night, but impact the whole country and a culture and the industry, I think is significant. And I think if you look at that night in 1973, the Black footprint, even though prior to me writing, directing, and producing this film may not have been acknowledged, you can't ignore it. Josephine Baker performed for the French. Come on. That is St. Louis. That's East St. Louis's finest, right? In Paris, on the stage, performing. The Americans played Al Green. They played the Love Unlimited Orchestra as the music that they would come out to. So our impact was felt, in performance, on the runway, in the designs, right? In the thought process of how they would move. Anne Klein's inspiration for her set was actually Caribbean and African. So the fabrics that she used within those designs were born out of that diaspora. So we are woven literally
Right.
throughout this story, throughout this industry. And I think these women played the same role that Black women have played in fashion history forever. Mary Todd Lincoln's clothes, designed, conceived, executed by a Black woman, right? Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy's gown, designed, constructed by Anne Lowe. So behind the scenes, we're always making the things beautiful and glorious, right?
Exactly.
That's what we do. We come through, fix the mess, make it fabulous, and then sometimes somebody else takes the credit.
Yeah, that last piece is the unfortunate part, but you're right. There's a history of Black women, especially being the ones behind the scenes, especially in fashion, making everything go and setting all the trends, whether that is by like the things that we make for other people or by our own appearance and our own culture. So you kind of set your like desire to make this film against the backdrop of that Psychology Today article and the discussion on the beauty of Black women. So how do you think you telling the story of Versailles kind of combated that negative narrative that was out there on the beauty of Black women?
Well, you know what I think is interesting? In that story, you learn that many of these models got their start in the Ebony Fashion Fair, right? That's kind of where they began. And I think being able to see that this wasn't an isolated moment, that there was a history of Black women being regarded as beautiful and striking, that one dismantles this Eurocentric beauty standard that does not even exist in the first place, that's kind of man-made and man-created, does not exist. There's not a Eurocentric beauty standard. There's a beauty standard of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And these Black women represented every standard of beauty. They represented every skin tone, every shape, every way of walking, every way of wearing clothes, and providing a canvas for the art of fashion to be exhibited in a way like none other. So their artistry as models debunks this idea that a model or a standard of beauty needed to be Eurocentric, that it needed to be white.
Absolutely.
You can look at them. You can look at a Beth Ann Hardison. You look at a Pat Cleveland. You look at a Charlene Dash. You know, they. This is
And they
not a
look
cookie
totally
cutter.
different.
This is not cookie cutter. They
Exactly.
were all beautiful. Period. And they didn't look alike. There was no we all look alike. That's not a thing. And that was not a thing in 1973, and it's not a thing in 2024. I think what I hope that hopefully people will go to Versailles73movie.com and find a mechanism to watch the film, whatever's their preference. It's streaming, it's on a lot of platforms, and really look at history, right? And how history regards fashion and how history regards beauty. And if you look at it, all the paths lead right back to us, right? Like indigo, where does indigo lead back to? Leads back to us. And people don't recognize the contributions of the continent, um, But when you look at design, even Halston was a milliner. He was a hat maker prior to becoming the designer that he was. But there are hints and there are nods to what we have brought to culture in everything and in every design. And I think that's absolutely extraordinary for us to discover, because we still struggle to be recognized in the fashion and beauty spaces. Thank God, there's so many wonderful new brands like Rihanna's brand that make it very clear, that we can be successful in beauty. But there's still not enough fashion designers out there, considering the amount of clothes African Americans purchase.
Yeah, and I think a major part of that is also like, our access to resources
Capital.
isn't the same. So there, we have strives to make in terms of leveling the playing field for us in this industry. I definitely agree
I
with you
think the
there.
industry has to help level the playing field too. I think
Yes,
there's shared responsibility in the access to capital, the access to distribution, the access to being able to grow your audience.
right. So I'm curious, like, what are some of the challenges that you faced during the filmmaking? I know we talked about money a little bit and some resources, but you were able to pull those together. What are some of the other challenges that you faced as you were making this documentary?
A couple of the challenges were getting the French designers to open up.
Oh, okay.
In my high school and college French was way rusty. And so being able to, I was calling, when I called DDA on the phone, it took a couple of calls because he's like, qu'est-ce que c'est? Oh, je m'appelle Deborah. But being able to communicate with the French designers, being able, they were all very guarded, being able to penetrate their kind of force field and get them interested in participating, because as DDA says, I mean, this wasn't a moment the French would prefer to recall.
Right.
you know, Given the outcome of the night. And then also getting a date at the Chateau de Versailles to be able to shoot. Only one woman had shot in at Versailles prior, and that was Sophie Coppola. So I was the second woman to shoot there. So
Oh, wow.
being able to go through the paperwork, which was in French, communicate, get the date set, wire the money over, just the production logistics of shooting outside of the United States, but especially shooting at the Chateau de Versailles, shooting in the palace itself, where I wanted to shoot inside the Opera Royale where this fashion show actually took place, and then going up into the archives. I spent an entire day with the archivist arranging that. Was the most rewarding challenge. She spoke absolutely no English. So we had to get an interpreter who happened to be this amazing woman who had graduated from Spelman that lived in Paris. So she was an interpreter for me. Once we got our rhythm, all of a sudden she started bringing out these files. And I was like, oh my God, it was great. But I think that, and being able to fund, a 90-minute film. I wasn't someone that was going to be able to get an investor for my first film. So self-funding a film was, not initially what I had intended to do, but it became what I did. And it's the greatest investment I've ever made in my entire life. And that was an investment in myself, and an investment in my dream, and an investment in a film that continues to bear fruit. Last year at the 50th anniversary, I returned to Paris and partnered with Ungaro and Halston and Cardin to screen the film at the Rex in Paris during Fashion Week. So, and that was brilliant. Alba Chin was there. A lot of the members of the cast were there. And to be able to screen this in Paris at the oldest theater in Paris with the models, and it was a glorious moment for all of us. It was covered by Women's Wear Daily. So it was a big moment for me as a filmmaker, but it was a bigger moment to know that something that I created in 2012 out of rage, partially, continues to educate continues to inspire, continues to touch people, and continues to dismantle biases, both, conscious and unconscious bias about beauty, about blackness, about fashion, about creativity, about who gets to be creative, who gets to tell stories, who is the keeper of history, and also to ensure that our history isn't lost. I think we're all, me, you. That's why you have this podcast, because it's critically important that we be the keepers of history, because
Right.
there is a very visible, tangible, and powerful force that would completely erase it all. So we have to protect what the people before us did, and we have to amplify that and elevate it so the people behind it see it as a beacon, so that they know that you can do this already, because somebody before you did it, so you got this.
For sure. And I just want to say I am just so inspired by your entire journey and so grateful for you using your talents and your interest and your rage to make this film, because like you said, it's very important for us to be the keepers of our history, to share these stories so that others can see representation and know that someone did it before them. So I think that's amazing. I feel like it's a dream come true to be able to speak to, all of these people and to be able to film at Versailles. I would be like just over the moon, being able.
I was pinching myself when we were bringing the cameras in, and I'm looking at the opulence and understanding the history of that building, right? Like, literally, my first production, one of my sets, was the Chateau de Versailles. This
Right.
is one of the greatest buildings in French, and one of the most important buildings in French history. And my small, tiny company, Coffee Bluff Pictures, was there with our location permit, ready to shoot and do these interviews and go into the archival building and scan a whole bunch of original primary source materials with YSL's signature on it and the Rothschild's signature on it, and Givenchy. Speaking with Stephen Burrows and speaking on the phone with Givenchy, like, made my life, right? That
I can only imagine.
it gave me life, but it also gave me the confidence to know that I could have a career as a filmmaker, that I could be a
Mhm.
writer and a director. So now, 12 years later, I'm in the Writers Guild. I've just finished directing 13 Days in Ferguson for Paramount Plus and CBS. That was in August. Earlier this year, I directed 4 episodes. James Brown for A&E, Say It Loud. So that fashion film opened up so many doors for me, but it also solidified and cemented my commitment of telling our stories, because I would tell Olympic Pride, American Prejudice next, about the Black athletes that defied Hitler at the 1936 Olympics. Of course, I would tell the glorious story of Alpha Kappa Alpha in 20 Pearls, which featured Madam Vice President in that documentary, and the legacy of Black Wall Street for OWN and Discovery Plus, which aired on the 100th anniversary to the day of when Greenwood was massacred. So
Mhm.
these are important stories, and to be able to be at the helm of telling them is the greatest gift I could be given. And I take that with honor and with gratitude, but also responsibility and accountability too. And this fierce dedication to ensuring that there's a canon within cinema that reflects our true lived experience.
Yeah, I want to talk more about your career in filmmaking because you focus on, like you said, telling our stories, and you gave a litany of examples of that. So, is there any project that you worked on that you would consider like your magnum opus, or like the film that captures your vision as, or not even vision, but I would say your purpose as a filmmaker?
I would say each one does that. I think, to date, the most challenging opportunity was presented in telling the story of James Brown, who was a civil rights icon, who was a complicated man who made good decisions and bad decisions, and being able to look at him through what I considered a very specific hypothesis. Was James Brown the most important Black man in America? That was a cover story in 1969. So I wanted to unpack that question and see if that question held to be true. So to be able to tell his story specifically against the backdrop and the context of America, because he was a Black man born in the South during Jim Crow, and he ascended during the civil rights movement. He began to lose some footing somewhat as hip hop emerged, which sampled and sampled and sampled and sampled his
And
music
still samples.
and still sampled, Funky Drummer, what? Come on. He's been sampled over 16,000 times. That's prolific just alone. But to understand the trajectory of a seventh grade educated Black man
Mm.
who would become the first person to own a private jet, African American in this country.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, James Brown, he owned radio stations. He was the first person to have his own plane because, he was the hardest working man in show business. He worked like 300 days out the year. So it was faster to fly to his gigs in his plane than to fly commercial. And to be really steeped in self-reliance and in owning things and trying to be an entrepreneur and having things. I think that part of his story was lost. And I think that it was a defiance. That's how he looked at entrepreneurship, not just as survival, not just as generational wealth, but also to say, I'm here and I'm going to get what's mine.
Right.
He was like, I'm going to kick the door open. But one of the lesser known things that he did was he, along with Donald Warden, who had been the attorney for the Panthers and one of the Oakland Raiders, created this black and brown stamp. And you could trade it. It was like cryptocurrency, but in the 60s. And you could trade it at Black businesses only to spur, interest in supporting Black businesses and the Black economy. So that for me was an interesting story because he's someone we think we already know. And to be able to find things in his story, in his existence, that's new information and to tell it in an entertaining way and an inspiring way. For me, I loved writing and directing those 4 episodes about a musical icon. And I love being able to have the runway at A&E to do that.
What's a story that hasn't been told yet that you are looking forward to, or you would love to be the vehicle by which it's shared with the world?
Well, right now, I have the rights to Coffee Will Make You Black, the book. And so I've adapted the book into a screenplay. So I'm looking forward to telling that feature film story. It's an important book, right? And it really talks about race and class and identity through the coming of age of a little Black girl in the South Side of Chicago in the 60s. So that for me is going to be a thrilling opportunity. I'm looking forward to looking into the Harlem Renaissance a little bit more and also looking into the art world. I think,
Okay.
yeah, fashion's important, but there's this conversion of art and music and fashion within our culture that's really important to unpack. So I'm interested in that.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you have any more fashion stories up your sleeve?
I do. I'm not telling, but
Okay.
I will tell you when it's ready. But yes,
Okay. We will stay tuned.
stay tuned. Yeah, you're gonna like this one.
Okay. Okay. Now I'm excited. So
Yes.
I'll be waiting with bated breath.
Yes. You're gonna be like, oh my God, yes, we need this.
And I know that you are Atlanta based. Are you originally from Atlanta?
I'm originally from Savannah, Georgia.
I went to college near Savannah, so I'm somewhat familiar.
Where?
Georgia Southern Statesboro.
Oh yeah, 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's super close.
No, I asked because, just Atlanta, Savannah, honestly, and Georgia in general has such a rich history, rich Black history. So I know that the world is open as far as, stories and things that you can dig into. Is there anything that you may have wanted to pursue at this point in your career as far as storytelling that just didn't work out?
I think there's a long list of stories that Nella Larsen's passing was one that I wanted to tell. I had submitted that to Sundance, and that ended up being told by Rebecca Hall. I'd submitted it as episodic, and she ended up doing it as a film before I could get it done. That's one that slipped through the cracks for me. I think also, I was very initially interested in Doña Luna, and that was done very beautifully recently. But there's so many Anne Lowe, Elizabeth Keckley. I mean, there's so many stories that I think are pretty incredible. There's one in particular. Prior to Stephen Burrows, there was an African American man that went to Paris and worked for Balenciaga, and that's still gnawing at me, his story. So I think at some point I'm gonna have to figure out what I'm gonna do with that.
Well, I really appreciate you and I appreciate your time in sharing about your career, sharing about Versailles 73 and everything else that you've worked on. So before we get out of here, please tell my audience what you have coming up, where we can find you and keep up with you, because we want to watch. If you're telling a story, we want to hear it.
Right. I would love if everyone, as you know, Black independent cinema, it's hard out here, right?
Yes, it
and
is.
and we need as much support as possible, not just for ourselves but collectively, because we're always having to prove that there's a market for our work, that people want to see, particularly stories that are period pieces or historically based. We have to always demonstrate that there's an interest in that. So please go to coffeebluffpictures.com and watch any film you want. Watch Versailles 73. If you like sports, watch Olympic Pride, American Prejudice. These stories will remind you of the greatness of our past and the greatness we've yet to achieve in our future. But please support these films. I love when you watch them on Vimeo. Of course, you can watch it on Prime and Peacock and all the stuff. But as a filmmaker, Vimeo is so much better for us because we can actually see and we get the data. We don't get the data from the other
Okay, I will keep
sources.
that in mind as I watch things, especially like the independent film. So you hear that, everybody? Go watch all of it. Don't just watch one. Watch all of the documentaries and watch them on Vimeo.
Yeah, so that way I can see, where people are coming from. It just gives us information, and that information is power when we're talking to streamers and buyers, and
Right.
when we're trying to get things financed or we're trying to get things distributed. We're competing against companies that have all the data. So as much data as we can get, it becomes very helpful, not just to filmmakers, but to fashion designers and any creative that's trying to build a business. It's
Yes,
the
I know.
analytics. The analytics, that's what's going to help us. So
Right.
please follow Coffee Bluff Pictures on Instagram. You can follow us on LinkedIn, and we look forward to seeing you guys at a film festival. Right now, a film I co-directed called Ratified is making the film festival circuit. It'll be at the Montclair Film Festival in Montclair, New Jersey in October on the 26th and 27th. It's the story of the 100-year fight to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified.
Mhm.
And it's still not ratified today in 2024. So, yeah, that's equal rights is not equal. And we have to pay attention to that because somehow that has slipped through the cracks. It's not ratified. And that is going to be something that's going to be very critical to our existence in the future. And right now, for that matter. So
Yeah.
check me out, Ratified the film, and come watch.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Deborah. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank
And again,
you.
thank you for all of your work. And I look forward to connecting with you again.
You will. Thank you, and have a great day.
All right, you as well. And that's it, guys. Make sure you check the show notes for a direct link to all of the resources that I use for today's episode. If you love today's episode or any episode, make sure to give us a 5-star review on Apple. It takes you all of 2 seconds, but it really, really counts towards helping this show reach more people and more Black fashion enthusiasts like you. And if you haven't done so already, follow us on all social media at Black Fashion History Podcast so you can keep up with all things Black fashion history. And the most important thing, if you do nothing else, come back next week and join me for another riveting installment of Black fashion history. Bye-bye.